Everybody ready? You want to bring your kid over here and watch the reading? It's going to be fun.
Come on.
Okay, well, I'm Joe Ozier, and I just wrote my first book, and it's about a runaway dog that found her forever home, which ended up being my home. But she was a tough cookie to work out with before she ended up staying. So after I read, you guys can ask me any questions you like. I am having some audience participation, I want you to know. So I want everybody to watch the cards, and we're going to have a little sound effects, and everybody's going to kind of have little parts to play in my reading, okay? All right. Shay the Runaway was a dog that lived for 2 years on the streets. Every day of her life was a struggle to survive. She learned that eating food out of trash cans could keep her alive, but it also brought her lots of unwanted attention. Everyone she came across was always yelling and throwing things at her. She thought that this was the way dogs were supposed to live, because it was the only life she knew. She never knew what it meant to have a real home. She lived and slept on the cold and sometimes mean streets of the town. She was always on the run and moving from place to place. She never slept in the same spot 2 nights in a row. The nights were cold, and the people she met were mostly unfriendly. She believed that this is how her life would always be. One of her favorite places to beg for food and water was the local fire station. The firemen were always happy to give Shay food because they could see that she was very hungry and that she looked helpless and alone. "The poor girl is homeless," said one fireman. "She has a very kind-looking face, but nobody is taking care of her. Just look at how skinny and dirty she is. This poor dog needs my help." So, on that particular day, that kind-hearted fireman gave her a ride in the fire truck all the way to the closest city. There you go. The fire truck stopped at the Humane Society, and Shay was taken inside and given a bath. It was the first bath of her life, so she struggled and tried to get away, but when she realized that the people scrubbing her weren't hurting her, well, and that she was smelling a whole lot better too, she started to enjoy it. Joe was a nice middle-aged man who lived alone. He worked all day at the library, and when he came home, he enjoyed watching television to help him unwind. After a long work week, he was settling in for a quiet weekend when a commercial came on TV advertising that the local shelter had a lot of great pets to adopt. They mentioned how owning a pet can help prevent loneliness and add years to a person's life, not to mention adding years to the pet's life as well. Joe thought to himself, "I want to live longer, and perhaps I too am a bit lonely. Why not at least go down to the shelter and look around? I don't have to adopt a pet if I don't want to. I'll just go and browse around." So, bright and early Saturday morning, Joe drove his car to the shelter and began looking at all the dogs. There were so many different types and sizes of dogs to choose from, but none really jumped out at him as the perfect companion. So Joe figured it was meant to be, and so he began to walk towards the exit. Just as Joe was about to leave the shelter, he heard a rather distinctive bark. It was more like a woof than an actual bark.
Woof,
Woof, woof, woof.
woof.
He looked over his shoulder in the direction of that woof, and there, sitting in a cage all by herself, was Shay. He walked over to her cage and looked into her eyes. "You have a good-looking face. You seem nice enough, and you're right about the right size, too," Joe said. He then asked Shay, "Are you a good dog?" Shay woofed and wagged her big bushy tail at Joe. Joe's heart skipped a beat. Joe knelt down right in front of Shay to get a better look at her. Joe smiled at Shay. Shay smiled back at Joe.
Aww.
Joe decided that Shay was the perfect dog for him. He couldn't believe how happy she made him feel. Shay looked like she felt the same way about Joe. So, Joe adopted Shay.
Yeah.
Shay got her shots and her dog tag and her microchip. Joe got a list of how to safely prepare his home for his new arrival. Joe then bought a big bag of healthy dog food from the pet store and drove Shay home. Joe took a bowl out of his cupboard and painted the name Shay on it in big bold letters. Joe filled that bowl with dog food and set it on his porch right in front of her. Shay couldn't believe that Joe had just given her food, just like that. Well, Shay quickly ate every tasty kibble in that bowl. Joe and Shay both realized they were happier than they had been in years. Joe watched with pride as Shay wandered around his backyard sniffing everything in her path. After a few minutes, Joe went back inside his home to make the necessary preparations for his new family member. Shay kept exploring her new yard, and after a few minutes, she noticed a hole in the fence. Her survival instincts always told her to never stop and to always keep moving, so she squeezed through that hole and was gone in a flash. A few moments later, Joe came back outside to check on his dog, but Shay was nowhere to be found. He looked everywhere for her, but no Shay. All he found was Shay's empty dog bowl. Joe got in his car and drove around the neighborhood calling out her name, but he could not find her. His heart sank at the thought of losing his new best friend. He wondered if he would ever see Shay again.